Hey guys, welcome to Biology Lab. I'm Coach Anderson for those of you that I do not have the pleasure of having in class, and I'm going to be walking you through a lot of the procedures that we're going to be doing today. So this is a lot of fun. We really enjoyed doing this lab face to face, and all the biology teachers got together and we decided, the next best thing to you guys doing it here in person at school would probably be to us showing you a demo of what this lab looks like and take you through the steps. So let's talk about the purpose of this lab. The purpose of this lab is we are going to be testing and trying to identify the presence of macromolecules in 4 different food items. And so the macromolecules that we are going to specifically be looking at today are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And for carbohydrates, we're actually going to do 2 different tests. We're going to test for simple carbs like glucose, and we're also going to test for complex carbs like starches. So we're going to perform 4 different tests on each of our 4 food items. And the 4 food items we have, looking at your table, just going from top to bottom. So I've got milk, potato chips, Sprite, and egg whites. And we're going to perform all of our tests on each of our 4 food items.
Hi everyone, I'm Miss Ransom. I'm another one of the biology teachers here at Pope High School, and I wanted to introduce to you the different ways that we test for these molecules. So what I'm going to show you in this section of the video is how to perform a test for sugar, starch, lipid, and protein. And then I'll also show you pictures of what a positive and a negative result actually look like, so you can use that later on in the lab to see if the food item contains any one of those molecules.
For the Benedict test, add 15 drops of Benedict solution into your test tube, then put in a boiling water bath and wait for a color change. Here you can see that reddish-orange color of a positive test on the left, and on the right we have a negative test, which is the same blue color as the Benedict solution. To test for the presence of starch, we're going to use an indicator called Lugol's iodine solution. All you have to do is drop 1 or 2 drops into the test tube, and there will be pretty much an immediate color change. It's a good idea to swirl the test tube around just to make sure that the iodine gets mixed in with the starch, but you should see a pretty distinct change in color if starch is present. On the left, you can see the positive test, which is a dark blue, almost black color, and on the right is a negative test that did not have any color change. To test for protein, we use a solution called biuret. And just like we did with the iodine solution, we're going to drop our indicator solution into the test tube, and we are ultimately looking to see if there is a color change. So just like we did with Lugol's iodine, it is a good idea to make sure that you have swirled that test tube around and make sure all of the biuret solution is distributed into the food that you're testing. Our positive result on the left shows a light purple color, and our negative result on the right shows a light blue. This test is a little bit different. All we do to test for lipids is to take a small sample of your food item and put it on a piece of brown paper. And then you need to let that soak into the paper, let it dry for a few minutes, then we can look at our results. To see the results of this test, you hold the paper up to a light source. If there is a translucent spot like you see on the left, it's positive for lipids, but if your food source has dried and not left a spot behind like you see on the right, that would be a negative result.
All right, so here we go. I've got my test tubes set up, or at least partially set up. Forgot to fill this one up here, so I'm going to add some milk. And you'll notice that my test tubes are color coordinated for the test that we are going to be performing. All right, so here we go. The first test that we're going to do the glucose test. And in order to test for glucose, I'm going to use a solution. This indicator solution is called Benedict's solution. And if I look at my lab directions, I'm going to place 15 drops of the Benedict solution in the green test tube. All right, and now if I look at my directions, that test tube, after I mix it gently, is going to need to sit in a hot water bath for about 2 minutes. So I'm going to put that over here and let that hang out while I perform my other tests. So next up, the second test, we are going to be testing for starch, and we're going to test for starch in our yellow test tube. And looking at my lab sheet, in order to test for starch, I'm going to be using iodine solution. And I'm going to put a couple drops of iodine in there and mix that gently. And the next test, we're going to be looking at proteins. We're going to test for proteins in our blue test tube. And the way that I test for proteins is I'm using a solution called biuret. And I'm going to add some drops of biuret in there. And I want to mix that thoroughly. The last test is lipids, and to test for lipids, we're going to take a couple drops of milk and we're going to drop them onto a sheet. I think you guys can see that right there. Just a sheet, it's just a little piece of a brown paper bag, right? So I'm going to put a couple drops of milk on that. I'm going to rub it in gently with my finger, and I'm going to let that dry. All right, here we go. Now we are looking at our second food item, which is our potato chips. So what I've done, I've smashed up some potato chips and I've placed a little bit in each of our test tubes and added a little bit of water to mix it together. All right, so let's go through the same procedure again for each of our tests for our potato chips. All right, so the first test I'm going to do, glucose test, and I'm doing that in the green test tube. I'm going to add my 15 drops of Benedict solution. And remember, I have to let that hang out in my warm water bath for a couple minutes. Okay, next I'm going to perform the test for starches, again using iodine. Put a couple drops in there. Give that a little mix. And next, I'm going to test for protein using my biuret. So put some biuret solution in there. Give that a good mix. And we're going to let that hang out. And then lastly, I'm going to test for lipids. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to take some of my crushed up potato chips, and I'm just going to take my finger and press hardly and kind of just smear these crushed potato chips on this paper bag. There we go. And knock all my potato chips off. And we'll come back in just a second after that dries a little bit, and we'll check on those. Okay, so now we are looking at our third food item. So I've got Sprite in each of my test tubes, and I'm going to go through each of my tests, right? So remember that first test I'm doing, I'm testing for glucose. That's going to be in the green test tube. I'm going to add my 15 drops of Benedict solution. And remember that the Benedict solution has to sit in that warm water bath for about 2 minutes in order to see a color change. So I'm going to let that hang out while I perform the rest of my tests. Okay, next I'm testing for starches. I'm going to use a couple drops of iodine in my yellow test tube. Give that a little mix. And I'm going to move on to my protein test. Protein test is going to be in the blue test tube, and I'm adding biuret to that. And last, I'm going to test for lipids. So I've got my clean brown paper bag right there, and I'm going to put a couple drops of Sprite on there and gently rub that into the paper bag with my finger and give that a minute or two to dry. All right, so here we go with our last food item. Again, we're going to do each of those same 4 tests that we've been doing all along. So now I'm looking at egg whites, and the first test I'm going to do is for our glucose using Benedict solution. So 15 drops of Benedict solution. And we're going to let that hang out in our warm water bath. All right. Next, starches in our yellow test tube. Got some iodine, drops. Let that hang out and do its thing. And the last test that I'm going to be performing for proteins in my blue test tube using biuret. All right. And lastly, checking for lipids on my paper bag. So I'm going to put a couple drops of that egg white solution on here, give that a little mix, and let that dry for a second.